Welcome to our second daily roundup from the Energy Intelligence Forum. I'm Ronan Kavanagh, Deputy Editor of EI New Energy, and I'm delighted to be joined by three of our moderators from today's sessions to share some of the insights they gleaned. From Washington, DC, TJ Conway, who heads up energy transition research here at Energy Intelligence. From Houston, Noah Brenner, our Executive Editor for Operations and Editorial Director, Eastern Hemisphere. And from Vancouver, Energy Intelligence's Editor-in-Chief and Head of Americas, David Pike. Noah, let me come to you first. You had leadership dialogues with the CEOs of two European majors who are pivoting on climate and the energy transition. And Patrick Pouyanné accepted our 2020 Energy Innovation Award, which recognized the steps Total has already taken. You talked to him too, didn't you, about Total's approach to the challenge and what makes it different. What did he have to say?
Sure. I think one of the things that struck me is just that Total they were an early entrant into renewables, compared to their peers and their peer oil companies, and that their strategy really has evolved. He admitted that they didn't get everything right at the first juncture, and that they have been learning and adjusting their strategy as they've gone along. And so, among those things that they've focused on are getting teams on the ground in these various areas where they would like to expand in their renewables, their kind of electrons business, as he refers to it. And as well, integrating across the value chain of power and renewables so that they don't just have exposure in one certain part. They started with sun power. It was very focused in the solar space. And then they've gone and expanded into things like batteries, to things like charging. But I guess what most struck me, or what I'm most keeping in mind, is just this idea that strategies are going to change. We've looked at oil and gas strategies here at Energy Intelligence for some time and really parsed through the details. And I think we need to do the same for these renewable strategies, because they're not going to be static. And I found that, I think it's really interesting, and I think it's different than maybe some might look at the space.
The new technologies, Pouyanné was upbeat on hydrogen, wasn't he?
He was quite upbeat on hydrogen. Actually, our audience was quite upbeat on hydrogen as well. I think more than half of the people thought that within the next 10 years, we might see hydrogen really disrupt our energy system. Patrick saw that there was opportunities, whether it was in decarbonization of gas or in transport, but he as well saw a bright future for hydrogen.
Now, you talked to Ben van Beurden too, who had a slightly different take on hydrogen, didn't he?
Well, I think Ben acknowledged that hydrogen certainly has a role. Ben pointed out particularly, I had asked him about its role kind of in the decarbonization of gas. They're a major LNG player, but he pointed out, opportunities in things like heavy transport and industry. But, I think he rightly said that if the world is going to limit its appetite for hydrogen to simply a green hydrogen, one that's made through the combination of renewables and electrolyzers from water, that it might have a limited role to play. I think that he was saying that if we really want hydrogen to have a broader use, to have a larger role in the energy mix, that we do have to open up to things like blue hydrogen, which would be using natural gas combined with carbon capture to decarbonize the stream there. And so I'm not sure that he was any necessarily less enthusiastic, but I think he was very realistic about the ways that hydrogen will need to develop to have a bigger place.
Great, thank you, Noah. Now, TJ, you had a very lively and fascinating panel on the energy transition. You were asking how quickly we'll reach a lower carbon future and what impact COVID will have, of course. Now, you ran a delegate poll, which threw up a surprising result, perhaps.
Certainly. I think, as we've been analyzing the impact of the pandemic on the energy transition over the course of this year internally, we definitely were of the view as well that this will likely accelerate the transition for a number of reasons. But what was still striking, despite that position, starting point for us was just how overwhelmingly the audience responded, saying that, with almost 2/3 of the audience saying that they expect the pandemic to accelerate the transition. There's still about 20% that said that, it was up in the air. There was still a lot of uncertainty. It's too early to tell. I think the other point that came across clearly is that almost no one thought that the pandemic was going to slow the transition, and so that was then also reflected in the panelists' discussion as well, just highlighting some of the reasons why this is taking place. The fact that that climate change and the pandemic in some ways are related in the sense that this is showing the importance of science and just focusing minds on important societal challenges. There's also this sort of march forward in technologies, which are also helping to propel this forward, and then also investor expectations and demands, and they continue to rise too, despite the challenges that that the industry is facing during the pandemic.
We've heard a lot in the past few days about new technologies, as we just discussed, kind of hydrogen and CCS as well. Are these silver bullets though?
Right. Yes. You're definitely trying to get me to say not silver bullet, but silver buckshot, I think was the term that Jules Kornhorst used during our discussion from Rocky Mountain Institute. This notion that was also described by others that there's not going to be one single technology, although as Noah was just mentioning, hydrogen is getting a lot of attention. So is CCS. The idea that I think was put forth is that we still need to think about technological progress and adapting and transforming the energy system in many different ways technologically, and that will continue. And I think that partly related to that is also putting in place the policy incentives necessary to advance those technological goals.
Now, you mentioned policy. Now, this is going to be critical, isn't it? Particularly coming out of the pandemic. How is this viewed?
Right. So I think that there's a general perception that with the sort of the emergence, the recovery from this pandemic, when it does happen, that there will be a push for green recovery efforts. We're already seeing that in Europe. We're seeing that being discussed at least at least from one side of the political system in the United States, and then also we have China with its very significant carbon neutrality goal by 2060, all coming together at the same time. So I think that there's this sense that momentum is building on the policy front. One important idea also that was put out there is just that it's not just about specific policies. It's also about creating and fostering this sense that we have a policy environment that is receptive to advances, for the energy transition. And so we see that was discussed by Jules Kornhorst again at Rocky Mountain Institute. But it gives you a sense that that helps to provide certainty for investors, and that's a key aspect of this as well, not just specific targeted policies.
Thank you. Now, when it comes to policy and the difference it could make, there's nothing bigger perhaps than the upcoming US presidential election. Will there be a radical change in US energy and climate policy? David, you talked to Dennis Kucinich, US congressman and a former presidential candidate, about this. Are we in for a surprise?
Yes, well, it was an interesting session, wasn't it? The audience poll suggested it was going to be 78% in favor of a Biden victory and only 22% in favor of Trump. So the audience has clearly bought into the idea of this blue wave. But Dennis was much more cautious, and I guess we have to remember he is an insider. He was much more reluctant. We pushed him hard to make a prediction, and he just wouldn't go there. He said it was just too hard to call. The Democrats have made it a referendum on the Trump presidency, but the Trump can lose that referendum and still win in the Electoral College. He also noted, I think, that Trump still has a lot of support from working class voters, and they tend to be underrepresented in polling models. So I guess a single takeaway is that according to Dennis Kucinich, it's closer than our own audience polls and perhaps some of the other polls would suggest.
But how much difference would a Biden presidency make, for climate and the energy industry?
Yeah, so he gave an interesting response there, not perhaps what we would have expected. He noted, of course, that Biden has recognized the climate issue, but he was very skeptical about Biden doing anything radical or significant on energy and the environment. basically saying that the political establishment in Washington is too static. The Green New Deal he described, I think, as a vague high sign targeted at the younger generation. And he in his view, he thought the presidency, the Biden presidency, if we see one, would push ahead with drilling, production, rising CO2 levels, regardless. I think his exact words were, sorry kids, not this candidate, not this party platform, and not this election. On the other hand, I think he intimated that this isn't necessarily permanent. He was talked about sort of party leadership potentially evolving. And we also had an interesting audience question, which is whether the progressive wing of the Democratic Party could force or would force Biden to act. I mean, I know that our correspondents in DC question whether it is even a progressive wing in the party or it is actually the whole Democratic Party has shifted. In answer to that, we'll only find out if Biden wins on November the 3rd.
Now, whatever your view on who will win, or one thing that does seem clear is that there will be increasing political polarization in the US. But beyond politics, I mean, there are wider drivers to the energy transition, from investors, from society that we should keep in mind, shouldn't we?
Yes, I think it was in the Q&A session, two important points emerged. One, that the US popular mood or popular opinion on climate and energy is shifting, the zeitgeist, if you will. The old assumption that the US is an outlier, it's full of climate skeptics, that's the perception from the outside, at least, that is changing. And it may not be evident so much in federal politics, but it is playing out at a broader or a lower level. The other, I think, was that there are some risks if we look at this only in terms of federal politics, only through that prism. But this deeper shift that came out of the discussion will play out on many other levels: public opinion, state and city policies, investors, banks, and so on. So Dennis Kucinich, I think his underlying message was that change is coming, if not now, then in a few years at the political level. And the companies should be proactive. They should try and get out ahead. And regardless of what happens at the federal level, they shouldn't interpret any lack of action in Washington as a lack of change at a national level.
Thank you. Now, speaking of company strategies, I mean, one thing we're waiting for is more details on Shell's transition strategy. Noah, can I come back to you quickly? Did we get any clarity on this from Ben van Beurden?
Sure. I think we did get, we got maybe a sneak peek. I'm not sure that we know a lot more detail than we did before necessarily. But I mean, like peers, say like Total or BP, who have given us more detail. I mean, BP had 3 days, I think, of detail. Shell strategy is going to be focused more on consumers. They're looking more at, say, a shift from what we might have thought as a traditional commodity markets where they're going to be making their money towards these touch points. Seems to be a catchphrase among many of the companies that we talk to. And it's in part driven by the shifting mix in the energy transition. But I mean, I think it's also, when he says that Shell's ability to achieve its emissions goals depend on bringing consumers along with them or meeting the needs of consumers, I think that plays into it as well. If Shell is going to be net zero, Shell needs to find ways to help its consumers be net zero as well. And so, this is something that is certainly not unique to Shell. It's a shift that we're seeing across the industry. But I would expect to hear much more around that specific topic from Shell in February.
Thank you, Noah. Now we've come to the end of our roundup of what happened at today's forum, but please stay with us now as I hand over to Energy Intelligence Alex Schindler for a tribute to our dearly departed conference chairman, colleague and friend, Herman Franzen.
Thank you, Ronan, for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Ronan said, I want to take a minute here to address something we've referenced during the program a few times, but I want to sort of do it properly right now. So it's a bit of a somber tone, but I hope it's also a bit of a celebration as well. So as we've referenced a few times, in January this year, we lost one of the cornerstones of the 40-year conference that we've been holding, and part of the Energy Intelligence family in Herman Franzen. And Herman was the chairman of the Oil and Money Conference, which celebrated its 40th anniversary last year. And he famously, as he said last year at the event, attended every single one of those conferences since 1980. So this is the first event since 1980 that will not have Herman's energy, his compassion, and really his curiosity that we all valued so much. So for that, we're all worse off. So let me say a few words about this. I mean, first is energy. I mean, Herman was 80 years old, but he was an extremely young 80. As many of you who are watching right now, Herman dedicated his life to understanding, analyzing, discussing the fields of energy. As an economist, he was fascinated with the intersection of energy, geopolitics, economics. I've had many conversations with him over the years about these topics, and he actively traveled to keep himself engaged. So that this sort of drive and energy that he had was remarkable for a man of any age, frankly. And for those of you who do have the pleasure of knowing Herman personally, you will certainly know his work. He was the chief economist for the International Energy Agency in the early 80s, and he oversaw the very first release of the World Energy Outlook, the same report that came out this week in 1983. And after that, he went to Oman, as one does, and became an economic advisor to the Ministry of Petroleum, where he stayed for a decade. And so Herman was a Dutchman. After his formal education, spent time in America, then went to Oman, and then came back to America. And even after this return to America, Herman really never stopped that energy to sort of explore the world. And I would bump into him in coffee breaks randomly in the Middle East or in Europe, and I had no idea he was going to be there, even though we work in the same company. And that was just how Herman rolled. It was just sort of remarkable where he'd sort of turn up. Second was his compassion, and specifically, I would say his personal touch. And I remember when I had my first child, a daughter, and Herman was one of the first people to send me a message and just to say, baby girls are the greatest gift to give a father, and he should know. As a father of two girls, who he absolutely adored, he was obviously in a position to know. And he was a truly devoted husband, father, grandfather. He would often speak of his wife, Maureen, of 50 years, and his daughters, Michelle and Lynn. And so he was a really kind of dedicated family man as well, which is always clear in your interactions with him. And then finally, his curiosity, which was one of his most special characteristics. It was really his desire to always still be in the game. And again, personal story. One time when I was living in Dubai, he showed up at one point. And I remember I was exhausted after some transcontinental trip across multiple time zones. And here Herman had just showed up from, I think, Washington, and on a sort of direct flight to Dubai, sitting in economy. And, he was obviously tired. And I remember wondering and asking him, Herman, you don't have to do all this stuff. Why are you coming to this sort of fairly irrelevant conference in Abu Dhabi? What's the point of that? And, I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, look, he's like, I have many friends that have retired, but after they retire, they go from active, engaged, and sharp to slower and slower and slower. So basically, he would never retire. And why would he? Because this was the sort of industry and the subject that he absolutely loved. So, it was fitting, but, as well as devastatingly tragic when Herman passed away on his way to an energy conference in Mexico City that he had co-hosted for the last 5 years back in January. He never stopped exploring the world. And I think this is what was, particularly special about him. So we have a short video in tribute to Herman's life. And then we're going to come back and talk a bit about an award that we're setting up in his memory.
Ladies, gentlemen, welcome onto the stage, Mr. Herman Franzen.
Good evening. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome all of you very much to the 23rd Petroleum Executive of the Year and the first Energy Executive of the Year award dinner. is very special for me because I have participated in every single one of those conferences, 2 decades as the chairman of the conference. So I started as a teenager and still here after 40 years. From the early days in 1997 until this year, and a special honor for me as a Dutchman to see that the second Dutchman now after Peter Voser has won that prize. In this little country of 15 million people, it's not bad. Our mission at Energy Intelligence has been and will be to bring together energy leaders of today to debate and shape our energy future. And how together we hope to find a way out of the maze of conflicting ideas. I would also like to thank all of my colleagues at Energy Intelligence, and this year we really made a great effort. We may be saying farewell, but looking forward to welcoming you back next year and thereafter for the first Energy Intelligence Forum.
Great, thank you. That's a lovely tribute to Herman's life. So what we're going to do at Energy Intelligence in honor of Herman and his long career, we are going to set up an award for the top energy economists, and we're going to hand that out at the Energy Intelligence Forum in 2021. And there'll be a special focus on those characteristics that Herman dedicated his life to: intellectual curiosity, that energy to sort of continue to explore the world, and of course, his compassion. So this award, we hope, will shine a light on the sort of intellectual work being done by economists to understand the profound changes happening in the energy sector, as we've heard for the last 2 days. There's just a ton of things going on, and to ground the sort of discussion in sort of data and science, which are great buzzwords these days. We think this award will add some heft, to the Energy Intelligence Forum going forward. So this Energy Economist of the Year award will sit aside our other awards: our Energy Executive of the Year, of course, our Energy Innovation Award, and our Leaders for Tomorrow Award. And we'll be running this process to select our Energy Economist of the Year in the coming months, and we're going to be announcing the first winner in 2021. So, Herman, this is for you, and you are truly missed. Ronan, over to you.
Thank you, Alex, for those words. TJ, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, sure. Alex, I think, when you kind of broke it down into those three main sort of themes of Herman's life that really have touched us all, it's definitely reflected in my experience with him. I shared an office with him. We both worked in the Washington D.C. office for many years together. And when after coming back from one of those conferences in Abu Dhabi or wherever it was, he would still be booming into the office, asking me all kinds of questions about what I think about this and what I think about that. And if we didn't have to go to the next thing, I'm sure that we could keep talking forever and ever. The other thing I would say is that I was actually with him when we were in Mexico City and in that conference. And the reason why I bring that up is because it shows, one, that he was still exploring the world at that point, but two also just the support that the compassion and support that he had for people who are coming up in the industry. He really tried to make sure that I had a place at the table, that I could be a moderator, that I could speak, that he always wanted to try to build the capacity of everyone at Energy Intelligence and beyond. And that was very special. We definitely have a great company, and I think that reflects the values that we have here. So for that, I'm very thankful, and Herman is very missed.
Thank you, TJ. And David, I mean, you knew Herman a long time.
Indeed, Herman has been a fixture of my life for over 30 years. I have known him since my early 20s, when I was a cub reporter in the Middle East. Oman was one of the countries on my beat, and Herman was an advisor to the government at the time. And he's essentially been there, always there, during my professional life. And I would echo Alex's remarks that he was always engaged, always enthusiastic, and always full of energy. I would only hope that when I hit 80, I am just as enthusiastic and energetic as him. But I would also echo something TJ alluded to, I think. I mean, I was also involved in the circumstances of his death, his passing. And I think both of us saw then was a glimpse into his family life and how important that was to him. And it wasn't a side we always saw. We would see the professional Herman, the enthusiastic Herman. But it was apparent then that he was also a very dear and much loved father and husband. And I think that sort of rounded out the individual very much for me, and I'm sure TJ would echo those remarks.
Thank you, David. Noah, you wanted to finally say a few words.
Yes, and I mean, I think I would just build on something that TJ had said as well. I mean, Herman was just incredibly generous of his time, of his expertise, of his contacts within the industry. I mean, I remember I had recently joined Energy Intelligence and I was working on a story and someone said, oh, you should call Herman. And I'm thinking I've only been at this company, a handful of weeks and they tell me to call this person in our upper management. And quite honestly, it was intimidating for me and I wasn't entirely sure that he was going to want to be taking my call or that I would be interrupting his day. But not only did he take my call, but he was enthusiastic about the topic. He had more things to tell me than I ever knew were going to be at issue. And not only that, but shortly afterwards, I got a text from a number that I wasn't in my phone, and it said, "Here, call so-and-so." And it was the personal cell phone number of an executive who was a friend of his, who he had made an introduction and said, "Hey, we have a reporter who's working on this story and needs some insight," and had made this introduction to someone who quite honestly I'd probably been chasing for years to try to get on the line. And I mean, it was an old friend of his, and he convinced them that I was worth their time, and he didn't have to do that, and it meant an immense amount to me. It made me feel. It made me feel valued. And I think that was something that really struck me about him, was just his interest in everyone and his willingness to share his expertise with anybody who was interested.
Thank you, Noah.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say one thing to that, Ronan. I mean, I think that sort of sums up. I mean, his desire to stay connected meant that he kept his contacts fresh. So many people, they know people in the industry, but then they no longer see them anymore and they don't make fresh contacts. He continued to refresh them. And that was part of the reason why he would pop up at these conferences in the middle of nowhere for no real reason. It was just to keep the contact book fresh. And he was generous with his contacts, as Noah said, and he made the effort to keep that continuing. And part of the challenge, I think, for all of us as the industry evolves is making sure that you stay relevant. And Herman stayed relevant. David said he knew him for 30 years. He stayed relevant up until 2020, dating all the way back into the 70s. I mean, this is amazing. So, I mean, I think that's maybe a good way to end it. It's the idea that you're able to sort of, if you want to stay relevant in this industry or any industry, you have got to keep going. You can't just sort of rest on your laurels.
Well, that is a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts and memories of Herman. So that just leaves it for me to say thank you now to our viewers. We hope you enjoyed today's roundup and you'll join us again for the final roundup tomorrow.
Thank you, Ronan.